I do want to thank everybody for being here tonight. This is the last Steve and Troy show, but Steve's not here. Steve's in Hawaii. And so Dwayne is here in lieu of Steve. And since Dwayne has more hair than both of us put together, I figured, we'll have Dwayne do it. Plus, ironically, it was really interesting that I was talking to Dwayne. I said, hey, you want to co-host with me on the last show? And he goes, yeah. He goes, I got this great guy, Dennis Dunbar. He does movie posters. He's going to do the whole deconstruction thing. I'm like, that's really cool. And then I reached out to Frederick and I'm like, hey, Frederick, do you know Dennis? And Frederick's like, hey, idiot. He's been hanging out in the TWIP hangouts for a while. And I'm like, oh my God, I didn't even connect. I did not even connect the dots. So it's a small world. So before we get started, I do want to thank the DVE store who has made it possible for us. They've given us this account so that we can have HD and all the cool benefits that goes along with it. So if you guys like all my microphones and my recording interfaces and stuff, I get all that from the DVE store. So I put a link in there at the top just to thank them for helping us do that. And Dwayne, my good friend, my co-host, photographer, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself real quick, and then I'll give you the honor of introducing Dennis, and then we'll just let Dennis run with it. Dwayne, go ahead, take it away, my friend.
Thank you. Obviously, this is the Troy and not Steve show tonight. I am a photographer who likes to talk an awful lot, so that's going to be really difficult tonight because this is going to be Dennis's evening. I met Dennis close on 10 years ago at another affiliate meeting in Los Angeles, and I was actually scared to death to talk to Dennis about retouching because I never thought I could afford him. I've seen his work. He's absolutely phenomenal. And the reality is, if you're doing your own retouching, if you are trying to learn about Photoshop, he is the guy. And whatever you think you can't afford not to work with Dennis. So I am going to start by asking Dennis, how did you get started with Photoshop? Because as I understand it, that wasn't your original career path.
Yeah, this morning I was having a conversation with a potential client. I got an email. It was a really interesting email. Like, it starts off with, this is not spam. It's not a bot. I'm really a photographer. I'm looking for retouchers. If you're interested, fill out this survey. Like, I called him rather than fill out the survey. Turns out he's a retired mechanical engineer. Like, oh, I studied mechanical engineering in college. And 5 years into college, I was only halfway through the program. I realized I really didn't want to be an engineer. So, at the same time, a close friend had gotten a Canon AE1, because this was in the late 70s. So a close friend had gotten a Canon AE1. He was the first person I could relate to that was having fun with photography, that wasn't taking dumb vacation photos of, here's me and Martha in front of the building, here's me and Martha in front of the tree. Stuff that makes your eyes bleed when you see the vacation slides. So so that got me into photography. And as my interest in engineering faded, the interest in photography ramped up, and it kind of took over everything. And I took classes where I could find them for photography. And that wound up working at a place in Hollywood that round out photo equipment in the late 80s, a place called Irana's PRS. And in those days, the photo community, anybody who was anybody came through the doors of PRS at one point or another. You had the famous photographers, Moshe Bracha and Gregory Heisler coming in regularly. You had, Annie Leibovitz was sending her assistants. She never came in personally, but she sent her assistants in. So, you really built a lot of connections, and you got really good with the gear. So I left there and started freelancing as a photo assistant. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I go from being a photo assistant to shooting on my own? And then you start seeing these stories about there's a coming thing. They're using computers to work on images. Like, wow, that actually sounds kind of interesting. So I'd be working on a job. I remember working on an architectural job. We're shooting an exterior thing. We're scrambling to get the lighting right and get it at the right moment. And the photographer is saying, in a few years, some guy with a push button and a guy behind a computer is going to put me out of business. Like, I'll be the guy in the computer. So that got me into it. And then once I started exploring it, it became the thing I was completely compelled to do. So just a little over 30 years ago, February of 91, I signed an expensive lease to get a wicked fast Mac 2 FX with all the bells and whistles and all that. And like, uh-oh, now I got a lease payment. I got to build a business and figure out how to pay for it. So that was how I got started. And everything else was, seat of the pants, figuring it out, contacting photographers I knew, like, hey, I just got this. I want to learn retouching. Send me something to work on. I'll do it for you for free. And building things up. So that was kind of how I got into Photoshop. It was like Photoshop 1 at the time. There was actually a competing program called Color Studio, which I thought worked better. But the company that bought Color Studio, Letraset, wasn't interested in developing it and continuing to develop it. So by the time Photoshop got to like version 2, it was passing up Color Studio in their thing, in their ability. And the guys who developed Color Studio realized, that, okay, they could get control of Color Studio back, but the train had already left the station for that one. So they developed Painter, which became a different kind of product. It's more oriented towards mimicking real life painting and drawing tools for that. It has a completely different interface for that. But Painter was the first program that had anything like layers. They called them floaters because they were temporary, but you could temporarily have a layer that you could work with in Painter for that. And they had some really cool tools too, like an image hose, where you can make a grid of clipped out photos, say a grid of like 9 leaves, different leaves for that, different angles and shapes and colors and all that. And then you could just spray paint them around. It would randomly paint them around like they're spraying out of a hose. And so if you needed to put leaves on a tree, like that was the easiest way because they were actual photographic leaves. So it had some really cool tools, but the interface got to be so weird. So anyway, so that was how I got started and swept up and all that.
So we end up with another beta versus VHS in the world of software, and start off doing work for free, now working for photographers who want you to work for free. And we end up in the world of movie posters. How did that happen?
Well, one of the photographers that I did some portfolio samples for was a photographer who had a real big advertising career at the time, JP Morgan. He had a big studio in downtown LA, and JP would do these lots of flying people with flying props and things, kinds of shots. So lots of fishing line and wire and stuff like that, and need to be taken out and all that. So I worked on a bunch of shots for him. And it turns out one of his clients was Roger Corman, the king of B-grade movies. And so Roger wanted to go from the old-fashioned cut and paste and airbrush days to doing it on the computer. And so he mentioned that to JP, and JP said, that's what Dennis does. Here's Dennis. So
when you say cut and paste, you're not talking about Photoshop cut and paste. We've got a few people in here,
right?
Or I'll say a couple of weeks younger than we are. How did you go about cutting and pasting originally?
Well, I first learned compositing in the darkroom, but I never did it with cut and paste like that. When I was working as a photo assistant, one of the photographers I worked with was the guy William James Warren. And at PRS, they would have these great ads for the cover of their catalog, and they would have these huge prints on the wall, and they use them for advertising and all. And William was the guy who would create those. Irena, the owner, was really smart. She knew William had the energy of a kid and the wild imagination of a little boy. So she would give him a fixed budget and just say, here, go run, make magic. And William would spend more than the budget. I think he lost money on every job he did, but he would create these amazing images. So like one of the ones was this Megatronic Camera of the Gods. So I was working at the rental house at the time, and he would come in and he took Pentax 6x7s, VHS cameras, all kinds of lenses, all kinds of equipment. He would photograph it, and then by hand in the darkroom, he composited all this stuff together to come up with this Megatronic camera of the gods. And it had a computer on the back. It would spit out the invoice for the job when you were done. It had a little screen for previews on it. It had, you know, I forget what you call the devices to hold the camera steady. They had the gyro spinning in the inside of them. It had a couple of those because it was such a big, heavy camera. And he pulled off the ad so effectively. Irena was getting letters from like Hong Kong. When can we rent this camera? Well, it's amazing. So I would have fun spinning tales about his images just to see how far I could string people along for the caught on. One of the things he did was he had a shot of from the Grand Canyon. So he's down in the base of the Grand Canyon looking up, and you see this beautiful river, and you see the cliffs of the Grand Canyon around there. And there's the shadow, the silhouette of a photographer with a 4x5 in the foreground. And all around the rim are little lights all around the rim. And they go, wow, did he really light the Grand Canyon? Like, yeah, it took him about 4 weeks to light these. It took him 3 weeks to figure out why these didn't light. And they would just come on with that before they go, oh. So when I left PRS, I started working with William whenever I wasn't occupied doing something else. He'd say, like, I'll give you a little bit of money to come into my office and just help out. So at first it was organizing things. It was trying to shoot elements for him, learning the limits of the 4x5 lenses that they couldn't focus the way he wanted me to make them focus and all. So learning that. And then one day he came up to me and said, Dennis, this is Amy. And he introduced me to Amy and said, she's going to teach you the darkroom techniques. Because he had these ways of compositing by hand in the darkroom using pin registration, litho masks, and all that stuff. So that was how I met my wife. You know, she showed me how that, and when it's in the dark room, you have nothing to do but talk. You can't do anything else. So you kind of joke and talk and, you know, gain the trust and all that. So that was how I first learned compositing, but I never did it by cutting and pasting and airbrushing like Roger Corman was moving away from. As I remember in those days, what you would do is you would make a print that was the actual correct size, use a razor blade to cut it out, and you glue it together, and then you'd airbrush the edges to hide all the errors. So Roger wanted to move from that to doing it with a computer for that. So that was how I first got into working on movie poster stuff.
So how many times has a new version of Photoshop come out and you've said to yourself, oh my God, we're going to be out of a job, or oh my God, I'm going to have 10 times more work?
You know, that's an interesting question. The tools have gotten easier to use, but knowing which tool to use and why you're using it hasn't gotten easier. So I haven't really had a feeling of this is going to put me out of work, thankfully. But I have had like, wow, this new tool just saved a whole lot. So like when the healing brush first came out, I was still working with Roger at the time. I always worked with him on a freelance basis, but I was still working with Roger. And one of the things they were doing was re-releasing old movies. And they would find a folded up poster they had done before, like, well, here, we'll just photograph the poster. We'll just get a scan of the poster and have Dennis retouch out all the wrinkles and scratches and all. And that spot healing brush, or the healing brush, was like the miracle worker for that. Like, you mean I can go over this texture and it recreates that texture? Because cloning it meant you had to find the exact right pixels to put in that area. And the healing brush, like, oh, I can figure out what it's supposed to look like and adjust it on the fly. Like, wow, this is amazing. So I remember that being a big life-changing moment, aside from like layers and things like that.
Very cool. Instead of talking about Photoshop all night long nonstop, do you have a poster that we can take apart and show off some of the tools?
Yeah. Well, I thought one thing I would do is let me I got to turn it on screen share, and I'm going to share the desktop. And there, you guys see the PDF?
It's there.
Yep.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I just wanted to show people some of the stuff I've worked on. This is just a sampling of things. Several years ago when Jumanji came out, this is what, maybe 5-6 years ago now, I worked in-house for a ad agency called The Refinery. I was freelancing for them for about 5 or 6 weeks. And the first day I came in, they said, okay, we have this, we have these 3 or 4 posters for this movie we're going to have to do. It's going to be, real rushed. And so you start working on it. And then a couple hours later, like, oh, wait, now the client's changing their mind. Hold on, work on this other thing instead. So for like 5 weeks, it was that constant thing, start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. And then finally the last week, okay, the clients ran out of time. They finally made a decision. So now go ahead. So that was the process for working on these. So I worked on I think 3 of the posters for them. They had a whole team of retouchers for that. So I worked on like 3 of the posters for this. So this one was The Rock. I worked on one with Jack Black, and then I forgot what the actress's name was who was starring in that. This one was for another ad agency called Bond, and this is one of the posters for American Gods. I just love the shot of Chernobog. That was a great series. This was X-Men, I Am Legend. Like, wow, that's 14 years ago. Wow, that's amazing to think about how long ago that was. But the I Am Legend thing, a lot of the work for this was the perspective on those buildings. So the background is all hacked together by the art director. And they kind of like, we want this here, we want some there. We don't really quite know how you're going to resolve that and make it look like it belongs together for that, but they came up with stuff. So it was a lot of perspective work on the buildings, getting rid of cars that were in front of the buildings, replacing them with bushes, adding new cars in there. Just a lot of fun work like that. So that's what that one involved. Then there's more recently, there was a series of posters I did for Mysterious Benedict Society. Again, this was also for the refinery. And when you're working on something for Disney, you notice here that this girl here and this shot here, we're not seeing the bottom of the people. When you work for Disney, the entire person has to be completely finished. So they could move them around or move it to something else and use it some other way. So there's always expanding things out and building things, in a more complete manner for this. But there were 9 posters they produced for this, and I worked on 6 of them for these. And they wanted to have this sort of illustrated kind of look. So the art director had designed it with using Adobe Camera Raw to get this sort of illustrated look. But then we figured out, since we had to expand the canvas out and build it with a complete person, that changed the way some of the settings in Camera Raw worked. So like the shadows and highlight sliders work on the amount of shadow and highlight there is. So if a guy's wearing dark pants and you suddenly add in more dark pants, now you've changed the ratio of shadow to highlight. So the sliders are going to work differently. So we had to figure all that out to get the exact same kind of look for that. But that was a lot of fun for this. And then recently I worked on Cry Macho for Clint Eastwood. Tell you the truth, I liked the poster more than the movie, but the movie was okay for that. But I've been a big fan of Clint Eastwood's storytelling for a long time. So it was a lot of fun to work on this one. When Pigs Fly. This one was from a while ago for another entertainment agency here called Motion. For this, we had to make pigs fly. This one, adding the wings to the pigs. So this one, I think I have a copy of this I could show about how this is all put together for that. It was quite a hack job to put all this stuff together for that. In the mid 2000s, I worked full-time at an agency called Bemis Balkan. They're now called InSync Plus, I think. But we worked on Harry Potter movies for this. Then some Sylvester Stallone, a little bit of Marvel. This wasn't the final version. This was the version I worked on. And then after they said, oh, it's all approved and delivered, then they went and made some other changes for this. So this one's my version of that poster for that. And this one was Last Airbender. This is for a place called BLT. BLT probably is the largest movie poster design company I know of. And they do a ton of work there. Some really cool stuff for this. So all those boats had to be stripped in, one by one. The kid, we had to put the decal on his forehead and make it glow. We had to retouch that. There's all kinds of stuff I had to do. The guy on the upper right, I don't know if you can see where my cursor is, but the guy in the upper right here, the way the designer had designed it, had the cutoff from the highlight to the shadow on his cheek was really harsh. So I had to figure out another way to get the same kind of look. So that was a fun project to work on as well. And then more recently, this one is for a reality TV show, Love After Lockup. All these people are dating prisoners for that. So these people, this one was an interesting project because the art director had said, you know, all the light's supposed to be coming from the window on the far right, and we have to completely relight these people. So I had to relight all the people, a lot of curves and burning and dodging and things like that to kind of get it. So we kind of sort of believe that the light is coming from the right instead of from the other way, or, you know, completely flatly lit for that. So that was an interesting project. And then this was the main poster for this. And with this one, they had a horizontal version that they started out with, and they say, oh, we need a vertical version as well. So now you have to make up a vertical version. And like the guy's arm cut off about where the Love with Conviction line is here. So I had to figure out how to extend his arm up and give him more arm. And with that tattoo, fortunately, it scaled up pretty well for that. If you know what the tattoo originally looked like, you can see that it was stretched a little bit, but it, you know, pulled off pretty good for that. So, you know, that's just an example of what some of those things are like. For movie poster work, let's see. I talked about having, let's see. Here's the Man-Seeking Woman. Let's, since I mentioned Man-Seeking Woman, let me open this one up and show you what this Man-Seeking Woman poster looks like. Now, when you're working on stuff for movie posters, it's pretty common that you're working on really big files. So like 10 gigabytes, 20 gigabytes as a working file is pretty common these days. That's one change that we've had from the old days. As computers get faster, they just want you to work bigger. So we're not necessarily working any faster. We're just working bigger and bigger all the time, and more layers. So here
Dennis,
yeah.
If I can ask, because it's a little confusing, when somebody comes to you with a movie poster project, there's the art director who's got an idea. There's a team of artists who have already worked on various pieces. What is it coming to you like, or how are they describing to you what they're looking for as a final outcome?
Well, in the early days with Roger Corman, you would get a Xerox printout, like a Canon laser copier printout of what the design was supposed to be. You'd get a envelope full of slides and 4x5 transparencies, whatever they had for elements for that. And you would take that to the service bureau and work with them to figure out the scaling and rotation, everything. So they would try to scale it as close as possible in the scanning phase. And then you would start assembling it from scratch using that Xerox as a guide. Now what you do is the process for working on movie posters, it goes through a ton of changes. And so what happens is when they're starting out with this, when they start out with the work, the movie studios go to the design agencies, and sometimes they give them a brief description. Sometimes they give them the script. Sometimes, you know, they give them a pitch deck or whatever like that. But they go, here's what the movie's about. We're going to want you to make, you know, some posters for this. So, you know, start sketching up ideas. So they will have a sketch artist come in, and the art directors will say, okay, I want something kind of like this, like that. They'll have sketch artists just roughly sketching things out. They look for stock imagery, anything to kind of communicate the mood. And that begins the design process. And then it goes through round after round after round after round of the studio giving feedback, and they're changing ideas and throwing ideas out. They take ideas from one design agency and give them to another design agency. Hey, what can you do with this flying pigs idea that your competitors had? So everybody knows that's the rule of the game, and they just have to play with that the way it goes for that. But so you're getting all these kinds of changes and stuff going on. So my role is at the very end. It's usually coming in at the end when the studio has said, this is what we want. You know, we're going to pick these 3 from this guy and these 4 from that company. And we're going to take them, we're going to turn them over to what we call the finishing stage. So and there's a handful of people like me, maybe 20 or 30 of us that I know of that do the finishing stage for the movie poster work. So these days what we get is we get a comp, which is the fairly low res, varying degrees of roughness layered file that the art directors worked on. They have to work really fast. So they're working at a smaller resolution and usually, you know, not worrying about nitpicking everything and making everything look perfect right on that. They're just trying to communicate the idea and get it polished enough so the studio will give the thumbs up on it. So they hand me that file and then they'll hand me the original elements for that. And they'll give me a template for it. So in this case, where this little red line is, this is where the original poster was going to be. This is how big the poster was going to be. So I'll turn this up, and this is what the original size of the poster was going to be. But they knew this was going to be used in a variety of formats. So they said, we need this done all square. So you have to extend it to the top and bottom and give it width on that. So I have to extend all the layers out. I have to extend all the masks out and then scale it up to the size they want it finished at. And then you go into the painstaking process of going layer by layer by layer, replacing every single element. So you just start building off this. I'm going to toss a layer here. So you just start going element by element. Okay, come on, Photoshop, cooperate.
There's nothing like
There
a
we go.
live demo.
There we go. We got Photoshop cooperating. So you go layer by layer, building it in, following the guideline that the client gave you, and then fixing the errors along the way that come up for that. So you're matching what they've done and then trying to fix any errors along the way as you go. And you're just building it up little by little by little. So all this work here is just for the background. And then one of the things we do is always add in a layer of noise for that, because it comes from the old days when you're combining images from so many different kinds of media. You got, you know, a head crop from a 35 millimeter, and you got a 4x5, and you got a 2 1/4. The grain structure and everything is going to be really wildly different. So you would add a layer of noise to kind of give it a uniform grain structure on top. So everything would kind of maybe get along with buying off on the idea that maybe it all goes together. And then we have our cast and pig layers, and you can see how many layers with this. There's a lens flare. Here's a bunch of layers for the pig. So we have our pig. Now the pig you see is a smart object. If I open up the smart object, you see this is already clipped out in mass. So I had done it as a flat smart object for that. But smart objects are used a lot for this because a smart object can be several layers worked in together. It can be a lot of various things. But the best thing about it is all the original data is embedded in that smart object. So if I make it bigger, smaller, rotate it 30 degrees or whatever like that, it's going to always give me the sharpest kind of result for that. And then you have all these layers associated with that. The back legs. We have to add shadowing for the legs of the actors. We're color correcting this stuff. Some more color correction. There we go. We got the color coming in. We have to add in rope around them. And then we have the cast. And we've got all these layers for this. So you just get an idea of how many layers go into this and how good you have to be at keeping track of all this stuff for that. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what goes into a poster like this. And I think this version doesn't have the final color correction on it that the final thing did for that. And then we usually keep the type in the separate layers up above that, because when you're working on something for the it's going to go to a print, and most of the stuff does wind up going to print. You're going to add in the type and things like that in the final stage. You use InDesign or Illustrator or something like that to add in the type. So when it runs through, you get really sharp looking type, because nobody would want this. Nobody would want this type here looking kind of fuzzy or any sort of thing like that. So that's just how this man seeking woman one went together.
Hey, Dennis.
Yeah.
We have a question from Kim Shapiro. She's asking about how much time do you put into a poster, like what you just showed us.
That all depends on the complexity of the poster. So so let's see, man seeking woman. This man seeking woman one, this probably took me 3 or 4 days of working on assembling it, because there were a lot of questions like, okay, how am I going to make this wing work? They had designed the wing, but the wing was really low res and didn't look like it belonged with the pig. You know, when I look at this now, I'm going to have to go back to my history palette and restore this, because I'm seeing things that don't match quite up. So I don't think this was my final file for this. But one of the things I had to do was figure out how I get pig-like hair texture onto the wing and things like that. So there were a lot of issues to solve. And then how you get the background, because getting the warp and things in the background was a little problematic. So this one probably took maybe 3 or 4 days of work. The Cry Macho one, that took like a day.
So Dennis,
so it all depends on the complexity of the job.
You run into a problem like, I need to match the hair of a pig. I wouldn't even know where to go find in my library of imagery how to solve that problem or how to find pig's hair.
Well, fortunately, we had a pig right here. So what I did was I turned off all the layers except for just the pig. So I came up with something like this. And then I took a section of the hair like this. I copied that, and then I ran the high pass filter on it. And the high pass filter will it's used a lot for sharpening for that, but you can steal texture with high pass filter. So just to give you an idea here, let's duplicate this layer out to a new document. And yes, and let's turn off the mask for this. Okay, so we have our pig, and we want to just emphasize the hair texture or something like that. If I make a copy of our pig, so I just did Command J there to copy it. Then I go to Filter, Other, High Pass. And high pass, you don't get a lot of options. You get a radius setting, and that's about it. But what high pass is going to do is it's something kind of similar to frequency separation, but not exactly the same thing. The math isn't quite exactly the same as frequency separation. But what you're going to do is you're going to get a layer that is mostly 50% gray, and then you're going to get lighter and darker values on that, which are indicating the texture or the details or whatever for that. So the smaller radius you go, the finer the detail you're going to emphasize. The bigger the radius you go, the bigger the detail you're going to emphasize. So if we just want to get the hair, we're going to use a small radius, like 2. Let's just go with that for fun. So we go with that, and now we have this thing that's mostly gray, but I need to get it to be on here. So what do? This is where blending modes comes in. And when you're working on movie poster work, when you're doing what we call the finishing work, you really have to master a wide range of Photoshop skills and techniques. So blending modes is one of them. The most common thing to do is to use overlay. I'm going to use linear light just for demo purpose, because it's a really strong version of this, and you'll see exactly. Hopefully you guys can see that texture really sharpen up.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's what I did. I took a copy of this, and then I dragged it over the wing and kind of scaled and placed it. And I think I had to have a couple different copies of it and blend them in or whatever. But that was how I stole the texture for that. But you know, you can use this as a sharpening technique. You can use it as a way of stealing texture from something. Like Carrie Bean will talk about this when retouching skin. If you've lost texture, like on part of the forehead, you can copy another part of the forehead, run the high pass filter on it, put it on overlay or soft light's a really gentle thing, drag it over and position it and try to scale it and get it the right thing. So you're getting just the right hint of texture coming into that area. So there's a lot of uses for this high pass filter for that. It's also incredibly useful for sharpening, because you can see here that that pig now looks really tack sharp, sharper than one might ordinarily use, but it can also be a really good way of sharpening things for that. So that's how I use the hair of the actual pig and put it on the wing, and it actually seemed to work fairly well.
Very cool.
Yeah, so let's see. I'm looking
we
for
Dennis, before you jump in too far, we got a couple questions. Let's get these before we go too far. Jason Harrington is asking, do you ever get annoyed at the file changing after delivery? And he also asks, how are you delivering these files, layered or flat?
Well, movie poster stuff, it always has to be layered, because your work is going to get handed off to somebody else. Like if I just work on the poster for it. So to go back to the Man Seeking Woman poster, and we zoom out, you see this is square. They're going to make a horizontal version of this, which is why we gave them so much background. But the position of the people might change in the horizontal. You may not want it dead center for the horizontal version for that. If you're going to crop this, then let's just turn off the type and this. And if you're going to crop this for a horizontal version, you might not want the people. Oh, now you're seeing how much more canvas there actually is. But you might not want the people dead center. So you might crop it like this and then move the people over here. So you have your title over here, because that might play actually really nicely against that sunset. So everything has to be layered so that it can be moved around and repurposed for that. Like I mentioned, for the Disney posters, anytime you're working on anything for Disney, if a person is just head and shoulders in the poster, you have to finish the entire body, which means sometimes you have to find the legs and feet and arms and stuff to add onto it to give them an entire body. But you have to give them the entire body because they are going to repurpose that. So you're always giving them layered files. Pandemic days, all the time since pandemic days, we're working remotely all the time on these. So I'm delivering them through, sometimes I'm uploading them through their VPN to their servers. Sometimes I send them Hightail or WeTransfer or Dropbox, whatever. Every client has a different preference for that. And I learned a long time ago, what we're providing is a service. I'm not, as a retoucher, it's not my creative vision I'm selling people. So I can't get my ego into it. I can't get, wrapped up into, oh, the client wanted this darker, the client wanted that lighter, the client completely changed it. It just has to be like, that's what it is. I do remember in the days of working for Roger Corman, Roger had a habit of the people who worked for his company. As soon as you really got to know what you were doing, he figured you're becoming too expensive. So he'd fire that person and promote their assistant. So the marketing department, the marketing VPs were always getting turned over for that. And so one of the times when he fired the marketing VP and brought up a new one, this guy wanted us to match exactly stroke for stroke the lousy Photoshop work he'd done. And I remember this one poster, there was a guy with a hoodie on and his face was supposed to be in shadow. So I had a guy working with me at the time, a really great artist, a guy, Chris C. I've lost touch with him since then, but he was a really great artist. And Chris had worked really hard to have just the right amount of shadow detail, look really cool, like a really great photograph, all that. And the art director, the marketing VP came in like, no, paint black over his face like I did. And I watched Chris's soul die a little bit that day. I was like, what, really? I have to paint black over this beautiful work? So you kind of learn early on, you can't get caught up in that because we're just providing a service for it. And it reminds me of a lesson I learned when I was just out of college, I worked at one of the stereo chains. And in those days, you can negotiate the price of stereos. So it was a great experience in learning about negotiation and having business conversations and all that. But there would always be the client that would come in and send you running around and around the bend with this option, that option, taking forever and ever like that, and being, kind of a pain to deal with. And we always figured once they walked out the door and I collected their money, I won. Whatever happened in the meantime didn't matter. If they walked out the door and I have their money, I won. So I look at it with these jobs. Like, clients don't upset me with all the revisions and changes. Like, long as at the end of the day, I get paid for it, I won. I did my job, had a happy client, and I'm not worried if they make a change to the artwork or not later on.
You get to build the house and the owner gets to decide how they're going to decorate it.
Yeah.
Good way.
That's a good motto. That's a good way to do it. I do weddings, so I was really frustrated shooting weddings, and my daughter at the time, I think she was probably like, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 years old. She told me, she goes like, you can't care more than the bride. And I went, wow, that's genius, right? Like, you just got to roll with it. That's what our job is to provide that. So I know we got some more questions in there, but guys, I'll hit those up later, and that way we can let Dennis get back to demoing some images though. Thanks, buddy.
Okay, cool. I'm glad there are questions with it. It's a good sign. So people always like to see how how something like this X-Men thing came about. This was actually a really good story too, about making sure you have permission to show work for that, especially if you work in the movie poster industry. Always make sure you have permission before you show the work, because I worked on this and I thought, oh man, this is gonna be really great. I'm really anxious to put it in my portfolio and show it online. And there's a website called IEPPV.com, and everybody in the movie poster industry goes to there because the movie poster stuff will show up there first, and you get to see who's doing what work. It's a really great resource. IEPPV.com. It's a great resource for that. So I looked and I'm like, hey, the poster's up there. So I contacted the production manager who brought me into this project. Like, hey, is it okay to show that? He said, oh my God, no. Don't show it. Somebody leaked an illegal version of that poster, a non-approved version of that poster, and the studios are really pissed and they're trying to figure out what happened. So don't show that anywhere. So finally, months later, when I see it in bus shelters and out in the street, like, hey, now can I show it? Like, yes, now you can show it. So it was a great example about always making sure you have permission for that. And as a retoucher, I always try to do that. I never show work before a client has a chance to, can tell me it's okay to show, because last thing you want to do is step on somebody's toe and have a, create a problem with that way.
Dennis, while you're talking down this vein, there's a question here from Jen that's asking, do you ever reuse poster elements from one poster to another, or is that falling into the same arena as making sure you have permission to show a poster from a project before you ever post it or show it publicly?
Well, there's another consideration about that overrides everything else. And that is, do you have the copyright permission to use that element in something else? So I know some friends have talked about, like, some friends have said they have a collection of eyes, just the eyeballs or whatever for that, because it's one of the things like, oh, the photographer didn't focus the camera on the person's eyes, so you need to create an eye or whatever like that. So I have a collection of eyes they've collected, or hair parts or something like that, parts of hair, whatever, common elements for that. But my concern is always about the copyright permission. And since, these days, more than half of my work is working directly with photographers on ad campaigns, I really got to be an advocate for their rights and their intellectual property. So if there was an element from this guy's jacket, like, oh, I could use that on something else, like, I don't have permission from the photographer or the studio or anybody else to use that element on that. So I'd have to be really careful that if I did do something like that, it would be in a way that would never show and never be visible in a way. So I make it really, really difficult to do that. For that. So, the most you might do is you might look and like, oh, this guy's texture here would be a great texture for something. So you might do a high pass thing and steal texture for that. But it's really pretty rare I can do that. Sometimes they will have you buy a stock image from like Shutterstock or somewhere like that, and these are not rights managed images, so they're royalty free. And like, okay, you know, they had me buy it, they reimbursed me for it, but I bought that. It's like, okay, that's an element I could reuse for something like that. But anything more specific and some like stock image or whatever, you have to be really super careful about using for that. So I hope that answers the question for that. So let's see. It looks like I can turn off all the layers and then start the one by one process. So this is the background, and you can see if you look here at the bottom, it's got some kind of weird name. What happens a lot with the studios as they're going through the design process, they have teams of art directors and designers working. So somebody might come up with an element for a sky or a background or something that somebody else might say, hey, that's really cool. Can you pass that over to me? I want to use that. So they'll pass it around. Or somebody might like, this is just my starting point. I want a sky up here and I want something here. So I'll just keep this in my library, and it's something they created. So they might use it as a starting point for that. So in that case, they'll rotate that around. Let's come down and drill down some more so we kind of see how these things are put together. So here we have, this is, the actor's name jumps out of my head now, but we had the young Magneto guy here. And you see, this is a smart object. So if I double click on this, this was oh, this is a 66 megabyte file. So this was probably straight out of the camera, the way they had it for that. So what we have to do is we have to mask him out and do all the retouching on him for that. So that's what this is. You see the mask for him. And then I always do the retouching when I've got it. Let's turn the background. There we go. Come on. There we go. I always do the retouching on a separate layer. So that way, if I'm working on this and they say, you know, you went too far, like that thing on his cheek is supposed to stay there. Don't ever remove, you know, Bob De Niro's mole, whatever. I can go through and I can make an adjustment for that. I can easily mask that out or delete that or add some more. When it comes to working on like lines underneath the eyes, I will have a separate layer for that so I can change the strength based on how strong they want that. So here's running our high pass filter. And this high pass filter is used to sharpen. So this is using that linear light blending mode. The high pass setting was 1. So that's cool. It's a smart filter. I always loved smart objects for that. So it tells me what I did. Then I wanted a little extra on his hair. So I added some more on his hair. And then we get into a curves layer to brighten his eyes. One for his face. Some overall contrast enhancement. Some more contrast enhancement. Some of these things are based on what the art director had created for that. And then we have some atmosphere that's going to go in between him and Magneto. So this shot here, this is smoke. And one of the cool things about smoke is if you shoot something on black like this and you put it on screen blending mode, the black will disappear and you just have all the pixels that are lighter than black. So that's how we're able to make it appear over him. Now we've turned off all the background layers again. So there we go. Now you see how that all disappears. For that, we're just using a blending mode for that. If I put this on normal, you see what we wind up with, and masking that would be a real pain. So we're using blending modes for this, more blending modes, more atmosphere in between them. Here we've got Sir Ian McClellan and the old Magneto. So we've got his retouching. We have the lines below the eyes. This one, you can see the opacity is at 50%. So typically what I will do is if I move this to 100%, you can see I work to get just the dark lines from under his eyes out completely out, not worrying that it has to be perfect because I know I'm not going to use it 100%. But the client then says, make it 50%, like that's about right. If you say, you know what, can you lighten them up a little more? Just up the opacity of that layer. There we go. If they, oh, you went too far, bring them back a little bit. Lower the opacity of the layer. It becomes really easy to make that change for that. And then we have sharpening for him, color correction. So you see here when we have the color correction, we have two different adjustment layers. One's called color curves and the other one's luminosity curves. This is my favorite way of doing color correction. I call it divide and conquer. And I have one curve adjustment layer set for color blending and the other one set for luminosity blending. So now with color, I can make this redder, more red, less red or whatever, but I'm not really changing any of the luminosity of the image for that. I can even come here and I can play with saturation and things like that. With this, it's a really powerful kind of tool. I can desaturate them, pull the white point down. I have a lot of tricks I can play with this, but it gives me an easy way to adjust this color without affecting the luminosity. And then luminosity, I can make them darker or lighter or whatever, add contrast to them, but I'm not changing his color at all. So it makes that part easy to work with as well. If there's a layer called 507 copy, I can tell you these are layers that the art director had created, and I was able to reuse them. So I didn't change them. But one of the things the retouchers get really fastidious about is naming your layers. Because how many years after I worked on this, like, oh, it's this is using overlay blending, so it's a dodging layer. They just painted white in here to lighten his face. But if this were named lighten his face dodge, we know exactly what this was for. It would make it really easy for this. With stock imagery, if you are compositing images and you're bringing in images from some other source or whatever, it really helps if you make the name of this layer the name of that file. So down here we see this says mm19943.tiff. So we know exactly what file that was. This file here, layer 8 copy. If somebody said, what was layer 8 copy? Like, I don't know. It's just some blue paint or something they did for that. So again, we get really fastidious about name your layers for this. This thing's just adding some nice atmosphere to it. Then once we got them put together, we're building up the atmosphere. We have more of these funny named layers that the art director added. And then in this layer group, we have, this is something used a lot, a texture layer. For this is on screen blending. If I turn this off and turn the opacity up and the filter up, see, this is just a some kind of a funky blending thing for that. So now I gotta go turn everything on. That's the one thing about cycling layers on and off. Come on. There we go. There we go. We can turn all these things on. That's one thing about playing this game, because you can't turn them on too many times. Otherwise you wind up having to remember which ones were on and which ones are off later on. That's why I will use color coding for this. For me, red, if I make a layer colored red, it means that layer turn off, leave it off, and don't turn it on again for that. So I will, usually you hold down the control key and you can change the layer color for that. So red will mean off for me, just in case I mess up like that. Anyway, so we're just building up the thing for the color grading for that. And then there was some final color adjustment that they added as well. Again, most of this stuff is something that the art director has come up with. And unless it's creating a problem, I will try to leverage their work as much as possible, because we have a short amount of time to get this stuff done. But that gives you an idea about all the complexity that goes into something that basically just looks like a simple thing. Like, well, it's just two guys, right? You know, how hard can that poster be for that? I also thought I would show you guys some Jumanji stuff, unless there's some other questions, or Dwayne has something else he wanted to.
I've got a couple of questions before we jump into the Jumanji stuff. Definitely want to go there. On these last couple of posters, I'm seeing 30, 40 plus layers. And this is the longest I can remember in my history in talking about Photoshop, where we only talk about Photoshop. Do you ever use any outside plugins, things like Nick or On One, or do you prefer to work within Photoshop?
Since I work as a freelancer, and when I work with photographers, it's almost always I'm working from my own place. It's almost always been remote. But for movie poster work, the pandemic changed it. It used to be 90% of their work was working in-house. So I had to be able to work with whatever their tools were. If I had my own filters I was reliant on, and I go to work in-house at an ad agency, and they don't have that tool, I can't say, I don't know how to mask this guy's hair because my masking plugin isn't available here. That's just not going to fly. So I've always had to work with the lowest common denominator, which has been Photoshop for that. So I've almost always just relied on what Photoshop does for that. That said, there are some tools like I just did a project for a client. I just had a rush project over a weekend where they had some stock images. I think they're from Adobe stock, and they need me to do some retouching on them because they're going to use them. They're going to blow them up really big and use them as a backdrop in a video. So one was a winter scene. I had to take out some trees, add in ski gondolas. Another one was the interior of a lodge, something like that. Had a staircase coming down. It was symmetrical, thank God, but a staircase coming down and wrapping around, and they had 3 posts blocking parts of the staircase. And like, get rid of the posts for that and make that go. And you're going to take this like 50 megabyte file, and we need it as big as possible because we're going to print this thing up and hang it as a backdrop like 40 feet wide. So for that, after I was done with all the retouching work, I used the Topaz Gigapixel AI program. And that does an amazing job. Sometimes it does too good of a job and you have to kind of play with it and tone it down a little bit, but it did an amazing job. And that, so what I'm finding is if clients for a movie poster project, if they send me something and we just have a low res file, we need to scale this file up really big. Like a poster I did for recently for Paranormal, Next of Kin, the latest one that came out. I showed it on Facebook on Halloween, right before Halloween or whatever. You're looking down on a foresty scene. There's a clearing in the middle, snowy scene. There's a clearing in the snow there that looks kind of like some sort of weird animal's head. And there's a aerial view of a church there and some bloody footprints what are coming out of that. That church was a very low res stock image they got from iStock or somewhere like that. And I ran it through the Gigapixel AI. And because the AI had a good idea what it was supposed to look like, it did a fantastic job. Like I could almost see shingles on the roof of this, what started out as a blurry low res shot. So it added in the texture and detail for it that it could figure out. On another project, where there's people sitting around a campfire, it did a great job on the rocks, on the dirt, on the fire. The people's fingers and faces didn't quite know exactly what those were supposed to look like. So some of that came out kind of funky. So we had to brush that out and fix that another way.
But it was a Halloween poster. That would have been better.
Yeah, well, this was for Netflix. That thing with the campfire, that was for a Netflix show. It's not a Halloween movie, not a Halloween show for that. That is one thing that's changed with the streaming world. Back when I worked in-house at full-time in the entertainment agencies in the mid-2000s, they were really afraid of streaming because home entertainment, DVD releases, Blu-ray releases, all the advertising for that, all the ad campaigns for that was a huge part of their work. They're like, oh my God, when it's streaming, nobody's going to be buying DVDs anymore. That part of the work's going to go away. Well, now with streaming, instead of like 5 or 6 images for a particular show, you have like 50 or 60. So that work has exploded for that. You're doing so much more work for that. You think every time you go to Netflix and you see something for, I don't know what network is Squid Game on, but every time you see anything about Squid Game, there's a different photo every time you go onto that. Every time you navigate the menu, there's a different photo. All that work has to be retouched and created and designed by an ad agency. Sometimes those are simple shots from the show. Sometimes they're composited, but that amount of work has just exploded for that. So it's actually been a godsend for that. The only thing with that is you're not working high res on it. So everything is quick. It's like you're sprinting all day long, but that's a lot of fun for it.
I love the fact that digital is actually creating more work. With that, why don't we jump into your Jumanji posters and see what that's taken to put together?
Okay, so here is one. I don't think this was the final layered file for this, but you get an idea of this. This is what the comp was. This is what the original comp was, and then this is what we came up with. They wound up swapping out his head for that. So this was Kevin Hart, and they wound up swapping out his head for this. That was part of the decision they had. They kept changing it around. Like, okay, we're pretty sure we're going to use this background for that. We might change him around, so work on him last. So he did get changed. So I don't think this is the final color grading and all that work, but you get an idea of all the various layers and stuff that went into this for that. So let's see if we can drill down on this. So we have our FX, we have this, so we have this background here. The background layers actually look like that would be easy, except this is where that came from. And you see, this was working on, I'm going to make sure, I'm going to turn this one red. So I know not to turn that one on as I scoop around.
So Dennis, this brings to mind a question that I have. When you're working in this many layers, how do you go back and check yourself to make sure that you don't see the edge of a layer that you didn't blend, or, you know, find those little cloning track mistakes or things like that, you know?
Well, that's actually a really good question. And the answer for that is, I'll show you a trick. Let's just turn on a bunch of stuff just to have something. So one of the tricks you might do is you have to think of different ways of exaggerating things. I wrote an article, I forget which side it was for, SLR Lounge, I think a while ago, called like something like 3 layers help you check your work. And what you'll do is you're basically looking for ways of exaggerating what's going on, so you see those little mistakes. So let's call this checking curves. And so you might lighten it up a lot and look in the shadows to see if anything pops up in the shadows that looks like a smudge or something like that. For things where it's really light background, you'll darken it up a lot, and you'll look around here to see what's going on with that for that. And then there's the famous solar curves. And I have saved presets for this because these solar curves are kind of a pain to set up right for this. But any sort of flavor of this where you're just pulling the thing up and down, up and down, up and down, you get this really wild exaggeration of everything in your image. And then when you zoom in, you can see how exaggerated that is. So like, oh, maybe the edge of this, maybe that edge is a little too harsh. But so I turn this on and off, and like, no, that edge is pretty good for that. But I'm looking for any sort of thing that's going to stand out. Like here we see where there's, look, see, now this was hidden by something because we had middle rhino here. So I didn't have to worry about it. But you see, this would bring up like, oh, look at this. There's an edge there that doesn't blend right. Now with this particular stuff, it's all background work. So like, you know what, if it's covered up by something, I'm not going to sweat it. I'm not going to worry about solving problems I don't have to solve. But that's the trick for how you do that. And usually this would sit on top of all of your layers for this. So let's make sure we have that all the way up on the top. So you would turn all of your layers on and have it on for that, and you work on that. And then when you start off, you also put a flattened version of your poster on the top of your layer stack, and you call that sample or comp or something like that, and you turn on and off to make sure the positioning and everything else is going correctly for that. So you're kind of building it up layer by layer, but you do have to find these ways of checking your work really carefully. And then in the end, once you've done everything, it's zoom in really close. This is a lower res version of it, so it moves faster, but I'll zoom in really close and scroll like this, looking for any kind of mistake. Like, is that out of place or not out of place? Looking for any sort of mistake like that. I learned quite a long time ago, working on stuff for Roger Corman, the value of that, because when they first came out with layers, it was quite the godsend to have layers that you could work with for that. But one of the things that you find out is if you mask, like, suppose this horn was a separate layer, and you brought that in, you'd mask out the horn, but the edge of the image was like this, whatever, like that. You don't really care. You bring it in, you rotate a little bit. What would happen is the edge of the mask, where it was the edge of that layer, would get slightly out of register. So you might come up with like a 1 pixel line here. Now at this size, you wouldn't see it, but at this size, you might see a 1 pixel line. And I discovered that when I worked on something for Roger Corman, and they brought in a full-size proof that they had run for this, and there was a little line coming here, like, Dennis, what's that line? And I looked like, oh my God, that was where the edge of one of the layers was. And you'll notice every single layer here, just about every single layer, I make sure the mask goes all the way out to the edges for these things, unless it's something like that. But I make sure the mask goes way beyond the edges of my layers now because of that. So fortunately, they were a really good client and understood. It did cost me a few $100 to fix the problem, output a new transparency, have them output new proofs and all that. But that was a lesson about nothing goes out without being carefully checked over screen by screen to make sure that you're not making any issues for this. So we come back to the Kevin bus shelter. You can see that this layer here was actually coming from a more complex thing. Then we got Kevin that we've added in here. And for Kevin, well, you can just kind of see all the layers here. I think we can go for hours talking about these various things here. For that. But you're just building these things up layer by layer by layer, going through this thing and reassembling this. And then you have the comp on the top, like I said, and you double check the position. Now, some of this stuff changes because that was creative decisions in the meantime. Like I said, this was the original thing they came up with, and then in the end, they wound up something more like this for that. But that was how that kind of stuff goes. This layer group up here is the guides. So what this would be is the different guides for the template. So typically the inner one is your type safety. So the type should never be outside of this one. And then this one is probably going to be where the frames for if you put movie posters in the theaters, they're always in a frame. So this would typically be where the frame goes. And then this is going to be where the trim, where the printer is going to actually cut the paper for that. So you want to make sure everything goes out to the edges and is, works really well and makes sense all the way out to the edges for that. So nobody comes up and there's a little white line showing up here or something coming in or whatever like that. But that's why the templates are always so important for that. So that's one thing that goes into the Jumanji thing. Here's another thing from the Dwayne Johnson one, the rock one. And this one, it was kind of funny. There's a guy I met on through a photography group on Facebook, Frank Mazzi, who's a really nice guy. He's a set photographer for most of Dwayne Johnson's movies. I don't know if Dwayne Johnson has the personal set photographer or what, but he seems to work on almost all of Dwayne Johnson's movies or whatever like that. So when he saw that poster I worked on, I'm like, hey, you used my shot. That's my poster. Like, do you have any idea what went into making this poster, this shot of Dwayne? So I thought this would be a interesting thing for people to take a look at here, just to see how much went into making Dwayne. So we have a knee, we have a body here. This is a copy of this, flipped and rotated around. So that's the basic body and the basic bike. Then we've got some retouching on this stuff going. We have to build out handlebars for this. This is on the color of the shift. Then we have to build his upper body. His upper body is different parts as well. This is adding in a waist for him. This was a color shift and adjustments for that. Then he's a head strip. And we had those work as well on that. So you can see that just the one part of the poster was really complex, like the Kevin Hart one for that. The one I did with the girl in the poster. If I just show you the JPEG for this one. Come on. Let me show.
No, Dennis, while you're doing that, Frederick is asking, do you handle the typesetting also, or do you ship the artwork to graphic designers for that?
You know, that's a great point. I do not. Oh, it's going to launch Lightroom. I'm doing the wrong thing. I used to do the production work as well. In the mid 2000s, when I worked at a smaller entertainment agency, I was the head retoucher. I was also the production manager. So, you know, it was my job to make sure that the production people working on me, whatever, that we'd set up all the typesetting and everything like that. And there's 1,000 things in this stuff. And I learned that was definitely not my fun part of the job. And I work a lot better focusing on the things I really like doing. So I don't do production work on posters anymore for that. So thank God I'm not responsible for that. But that would be like, oh, is that the right version of this Columbia House one? Oh, Sony has a gray version of this one that we're going to use now, and you didn't catch the gray version of it. When you have the billing block, you know, with all the credits and stuff in here, it was like making sure the spacing is right, the sizing is right, the order of the names is right. Did you spell the names correctly? I remember there was one time when one actor spells his name Jon, we had set it up not realizing he spelled it Jon. We had it John, and nobody saw that until we sent a proof to the client, like, you misspelled his name. Like, oh my God, we couldn't see that. So that's not my job anymore. I'm really happy to say that's not my job anymore. I don't do the mechanicals for that. For this was one of the other posters. I'm just going to show you the JPEG part of this. But one of the things that was a challenge with this was like this background element here. If you've seen the movie, you know, this cat mountain, whatever, was a really important part of the movie for that. Part of the problems we had to solve was like coming up with enough texture and detail in here, because by the time they had used these low res shots, all this stuff looked like it was sort of like a green whipped cream. It had no texture, little hints of light and shadow for that. So we were trying to figure out how to add detail into that, how to make the rocks look like, you know, the rocks were sharp and detailed and stuff. I think she's stripped together from several different parts as well, but you know, an awful lot of the work on this one was building that background and making that background look believable in a lot of ways for that. So do you guys want to see some more stuff, or?
Yeah, first, Jason is asking, how long did the Dwayne Johnson poster take to put together with all of the individual parts having to be reassembled?
The Dwayne Johnson poster, you know, I started working on it in fits and starts for that, but that was probably 3-4 days, just that one alone. I remember I worked on it in-house, but I took it home. I took part of it home to work on over the weekend. And so that's why I had the layers for how he's built on the motorcycle, because I did that work, you know, from my studio over the weekend for that. So I remember that was just a ton of work for that. That is one thing that's changed for that. the hours we would pound on doing these things, working on stuff for Roger Corman, working till 5 a.m., 4 or 5 days in a row would be very common for that stuff, just because the computers were slow and everything, the tools were hard to work with and all that stuff. So thankfully, the hours have improved over the years for that. So I'm not spending, working to the wee hours on this stuff anymore, but sometimes a poster can take, a week of just working on that project alone, just to make that one image work. What other posters do we have here that I can show you? We've seen that, Dwayne, on the right. Crime Watch.
Here's a question for you, Dennis, from a little while ago. Jason Harrington asks, how do you approach the agency to gain work, and how many times do you hear no?
That's a great question. An awful lot of this stuff with working on stuff for movie posters, there's a lot of pressure to deliver, top quality work. So it takes a lot of time to build up the level of trust with the clients for this. So, when I worked for Roger Corman, that wound up, since Roger worked with freelance designers and me as a freelancer, I got to know a lot of freelance designers who went on to work at other entertainment agencies. One of them was this guy, Mark Crawford, who I did a handful of posters for Roger Corman. And then he went off to work for a movie poster place that's now defunct. But he went off to work for this one movie poster place. The name escapes me right offhand now. But when he went over to there, he started like, hey, Dennis can do the finishing work on this stuff. So I got work with that. So I built up trust that way. And as you build up a body of work, they look at you like, okay, you've been working in this industry for 15 or 20 years. I think I can trust you. If you're starting out and you're wanting to do this, one, it really helps to be local. Pre-pandemic, the vast majority of the retouching work and the work on movie posters was done in-house in the offices of the ad agencies that work on these things. Part of that was for communication, but a big part of that was the studios are really, really security minded. So every ad agency would have a different set of security protocol to go with. One agency, the agency that I did the man-seeking woman stuff with, at one point when you would go work in-house there, they had a laptop and a desktop computer. The laptop was the only thing connected to the internet, and it had a one-way pipe where you could download a stock image on the laptop and download it to the server. So then you could access the server and open it up on the desktop computer. But the desktop computer had no connection to the internet whatsoever. So that was their way of ensuring there's no way anybody can leak a poster. Nobody can share something without the studio's approval, whatever like that, and we can keep controlling that. Everybody had a different set of protocols. So that used to be really, really important for that. When the pandemic hit, like, we can't have everybody working on that. They started developing other things. So one client has their own VPN, virtual private network, and you have to log onto that and work exclusively through their servers when you're working for them for that. And that way they're also able to track what you're doing on the internet. Like, hey, Dennis is uploading something to a site. We better check out what that's going up to the site or whatever. So you have to be really careful about that, because if you upset the studios aren't going to give you the work, and then everybody's going to be upset with you. Like, you're the one who leaked this thing for that. We can't trust you, and you're never going to work in that industry again. So you have to be really careful about that. So being local helped a whole lot. Now with the pandemic, they might be more open to working with people on a remote basis for that, but you have to figure out who the decision makers at the ad agencies are and figure out ways of building a connection with them and building up trust with that for that. So it's a very long process for that. So, fortunately, having been in this industry for a long time, you kind of have a friend, like, I might get a referral like, hey, your friend Eric referred us to you for that. We have a poster and lead finishing or whatever. You might meet a new client that way because Eric couldn't do the job, and Eric knows you can do make him look good by doing a good job. So he'll trust you to work with that client and make him not look bad for that. So, you might meet somebody that way, networking. Sometimes it's reaching out and using LinkedIn, like, hey, this person, Tony, I know that used to work over here. Now she's working over this other place. So I can reach out to Tony and say, hi, Tony, how's it going on? Like, hey, it looks like you're in a new place. Great to, keep in touch with you. So you'll use LinkedIn to follow people around a lot just for your networking thing for that. But, it's not an easy process to get into that industry for that.
I think that's why they call it a career. It's something you have to do every day.
Yeah.
With all of this, with the security protocols, not knowing what type of artwork is going to come into you for your next project. Is there a project that has given you nightmares, that's just been impossible to tackle or challenged you to the limit that you're going, thank God it's over and I never have to look at that again, hopefully?
There have been a couple of times when I've had something like that, but it's usually been more about the client than about the artwork I'm working on. So there was a ad campaign handful of years ago for a fine art photographer. He was a fine art photographer, not an advertising photographer. So the way he was shooting wasn't suited for what they wanted to produce. And, when they start sending you the files, you realize like he only shot a quarter of what we actually need to make this happen. And somehow I have to make up a lot of stuff. And then the client kept changing, we want this really blue. We want this really red. We want this bright. We want it dark. I'm like, oh my Lord. So when that job was finally done, like, oh, thank God, because with all the indecision, and you can't tell the people at the ad agency the photographer screwed up because he's the guy that hired you for the job. So you have to cover for him and make him look good. So there's always that kind of stuff you have to do for that. So it's usually been scenarios like that.
So with that type of scenario, you make them look wonderful. You've already pulled out all of your hair. You walk out of the building and you're going,
yeah, pull out all my hair.
God, when is the next job going to be landing in my lap so I can go through this all over again?
Yeah, well, fortunately, most of the jobs that come in are fun and really cool jobs. And I've been really lucky to get to work with some cool creatives on the cool images or whatever. One of the things that solves that too is having your business models established and your rate established. So like I had a job where I was telling you that I just delivered a couple days ago, and the thing for the backdrops for the videos, and they said, oh, we need this stuff. This was Friday afternoon. I'm like, oh, we need this stuff by Monday. And it's like, okay, this looks like it's gonna be 14, 16 hours worth of work or whatever like that, some large amount of work. Like, I can't do this Friday afternoon and Monday. I have to work over the weekend for that. Like, that's going to run you rush fees. So it's going to be 100% fees for that. I'm like, yep, okay, fine. Like, I suddenly don't mind working over the weekend now because I'm getting paid very well to work over the weekend. Also establishing a good rate structure for that. So, you try to be as flexible as you can to accommodate different clients. And you know that I've worked with you on your projects to be with that.
Sorry.
But also, knowing like, I charge a certain rate and I'm not going to go below a certain rate. So I'm not going to get caught up into the jobs where I'm working for $5 an hour, because that's where you really start hating life. Like, you know what? This client's indecisive. The images I'm working on isn't very good. And I'm working a bunch of hours and I'm not getting paid for it. That's when you really start hating life. Bottom line, if you can filter a lot of that out by, here's what my rate is, and happy to work with you. I can accommodate you somewhat on this stuff, but like, oh, I've got 20 images to do. I need it by tomorrow and I have $5 an image. I do get those requests. I'm like, that's not my job. That's not the kind of work I do. So you filter that kind of stuff out pretty quickly.
And last question, I think we'll open it up to the audience for questions. We're all photographers. We love to show off our work to our spouses, our friends. Have you ever had an instance where you've shown your wife or your buddies this really awesome, amazing poster, then went to the movie that the poster was for and go, God, we should have stopped at the poster?
Yeah, there have been a couple of occasions like that. A friend of mine, Eric Talladay, who also does similar role that I do, he says, our job is to set a lot of people up for disappointment. It's a marketing job for that, and it's fun to work on iconic imagery, but you have to remember it's a marketing job. And like, I'm not selling somebody pharmaceuticals that doesn't work. I'm not selling somebody a drug for 1,000 times markup that they need to survive on. So like, you know what, worst case scenario, you didn't like the movie you spent $15 on and 2 hours watching. Like, what harm really came for that? So I don't feel too bad if it's like, okay, we made a bad movie look more interesting or whatever like that. It's not that much of a moral dilemma for me. If it was, I wouldn't have worked on a lot of Roger Corman stuff.
That's awesome. So guys, we're going to open up the chat here, but before we do that, we've got 2 questions that I think might be big answers. So we'll just let Dennis handle those. The first one comes from Frederick. It says, once you have created the final poster, are you also responsible for generating versions for social media, promotion, email campaigns, banner ads, microsites, etc.?
On occasion, yes. So like for this Cry Macho poster that's here, the first thing started off with a vertical version, and then they needed a horizontal version, and then they needed a square version. But that was what you're told going into the thing, into the job. Like, okay, this is the first one we got to deliver, and then once that's approved, we have to do breakdowns for that. So it's very common that you do have to do that. Typically, the designer says like, okay, we want his head over here, we want the title over there. So you have a idea of what to follow. Sometimes I remember working on some stuff. I can't remember what movie it was quite a while ago, but like, okay, can you rough up some horizontal versions of this poster stuff? We need something for going on the side of a bus, which is going to be very long and not very high. Something that's going to go, on the side of this building that's going to be a square format. Can you work up some breakouts for us on how that's going to go and figure that out? One of the first projects I worked on when I was working at Bemis Balkan in the mid 2000s was the animated movie Sinbad. And they had the movie poster work the layered file had been finished by another company, but they needed to come up with a horizontal version of this. So they're like, here, take a couple of days and make a horizontal version. So that was a lot of fun because like I had complete freedom to like just move stuff around and like find a composition that worked. So on occasion, I do get asked to do that.
That's actually a great lead in from the next question that we have from Jen. Have you ever worked on a poster for an agency, created their vision, and then redone it just for your own vision for your own edification?
No, I haven't done that, partly because, especially with movie poster stuff, the whole permission thing about it. Like, the studios are really sensitive about non-approved artwork being out there. And, working on movie poster stuff pays quite well for that. So I don't want to do anything where I would risk somebody thinking, oh, like if I thought instead of this Old West theme or whatever like that, what if we, put Clint Eastwood against a blue sky and had a different color grade on this stuff? Like, oh, here's my version of Cry Macho. I thought it was kind of fun. Or if I made it look like an old sepia tone or cyanotype kind of, imagery or whatever like that. If I came up with my own version and showed that to anybody, if the studio, I think this was Warner Brothers or whoever did this, but if the studio saw that and got upset, I wouldn't work in this industry again. So I don't want to risk that. And the same thing with photographers' work. I'm working on their vision. If I took one of your shots and color graded the way you want, and like, oh, here's the version I did that Dwayne didn't like, Dwayne would probably not be very happy with me.
Or I'd probably say, thank you, Dennis.
Well, if you really liked it. So I do get more freedom with that with photographers, because like in a color grading thing, like photographer might have something and I'll say like, hey, here's your version. I just had this idea. What do you think about this? And sometimes they go, love that. Sometimes they go, hey, you know, if you back off a little bit, that's a nice alternate version. Or like, yeah, no, don't do that. Don't show that.
No,
So I have, you know, sometimes I get that freedom, but if I want something like that, I do my own work, and I get a chance to play around with my own stuff on occasion. That's where I get to play with different versions, and then I second guess myself to death.
Well, you know, you've got to protect your client, your business first. So doing what the client's asking is a great way to make sure that you're working tomorrow. Troy, I think we're ready to open up unless there's anything else that's come in.
While we're opening up the microphones, Kim Shapiro had a question. She says that you mentioned working for several different agencies. Do you go where the work is, or gaining experience and growing to larger or better known companies?
Yes. You know, now, fortunately, being an LA boy, I was born and grew up in San Gabriel Valley, so I've been in LA all my life. When it comes to working on movie poster stuff, LA Hollywood has been the center of that advertising for 40 years or so. So fortunately, that work is where I live, and I haven't had to move to get to it for that. And then when it comes to working your way up the chain for clients, like, you know, I got referred to work on a special project for these producers who are producing a movie, and it's their first time doing something like that. And they said, you know, they tell you the photographer like, oh, we need on a movie poster. So they go, oh, Dennis makes movie posters. And then I refer to them like, oh, what you actually need is a designer. And then you have me come in. And then, by the way, it sounds like you could use some marketing help. So I'll refer you to some friends who do marketing stuff. So they're brand new. They're just starting out, figuring it out. But it's a passion project for them for that. So I'm happy to help them out with that. So sometimes you work with clients like that while you're also working on A-list movies, whatever, for top name ad agencies. So it's sort of all the above.
That's great. So guys, if you know, hey, here's Dennis. He's right here. He's not going to be here forever. So if you want to talk to him, you got questions, chime in. Otherwise, Dwayne and I will continue to talk. So
now, Dwayne and I can chat forever.
Dennis, thank you so much. And what is your favorite poster that you worked on, or favorite movie?
Gosh, you know, it's usually whatever, like some of the later ones are. For me, the process about it is some of the stuff in my portfolio that I show on the web or stuff, like I only show things I think are cool. I tell my wife that's my filter for something. She'll say like, oh, you know, you need to include some images like this. Like, no, but those aren't cool images. You know, whatever that, the subject, the examples I have for that, I don't think are looking cool enough. So I'm not going to show that for that. So like, I'm not going to show e-commerce work. I do occasionally work on e-commerce work, but you know, how many shots of yoga wear do you want to look at for that? So I'm not going to show that. But for most part, it's about the people I'm working with and that process for that. Working with really cool people, you feel like you're part of a team. You feel like your work's appreciated. That's what really makes it sing for me for that. So that's the part that sticks with me the longest about it for this stuff. So, you know, there's some clients I really love working with because it feels like a great collaborative effort for that. But for movie poster stuff, the thing that's really fun about working on movie poster stuff is if I say I worked on a bunch of Jumanji pictures, a bunch of Jumanji posters, almost everybody's familiar with that and go, oh, I know what he's probably talking about. if I said I worked on an ad for these headphones that ran in a magazine, nobody knows what I'm talking about. That headphone shot might be much cooler than the poster I worked on. I worked on some really cool shots for product stuff, but very few people get excited about that. So that's the thing that's really fun about working on movie poster stuff. You know, I also worked with photographer's trade organization called American Photographic Artists. I've been on the board for a long time. And a long time ago, the guy who was the president, national president for the organization was here in LA. I was giving a drive around somewhere. And so I was like, no, like, what is it you do? I'm really kind of funny, you know, fuzzy about what you do. And just then we passed a billboard. Oh, I worked on that one. I heard that one, that one. Like, oh, that's what you do. So that's the fun part about working on movie poster stuff.
Hey, Dennis, this is the only time in my life where I'm ever actually going to get to say this. Mr. Frederick Van Johnson has his hand up, so I'm sure he's got a question for you.
Hey, Dennis, I'm just curious if there are any movie posters out there that you think are like the top of the crop that you haven't made. Like, which ones do you look at and you're like, oh, holy crap, you know, that is the, you know, amazing.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of posters that go on. None are coming to mind offhand, but like that's why I'll go to that IMP Awards site and look through that. Or you know, over the years, you realize that the network of people who do what I do for movie poster stuff isn't very big. The group of us isn't very big. It's one of the things that we're always kind of amazed at, like, how come by now, 30 years later, there aren't 200 of us doing this work for that. So it's kind of funny, but you know, inevitably it'd be something like, oh, this is something my friend Dan did, or my friend Lisa did, or Eric, or you know, somebody I know did a really great job on a poster for stuff. You know, I love the really well done art for this stuff. There's a guy who I met him first as an art director, but he did the retouching work. He did retouching, you know, the design work and all that stuff. This guy Xavier, and he has an agency now called 1030, and it's out in Burbank. And the artwork for what they do, it's a family of artists. They're all highly trained for painting and drawing and all that stuff. And every poster they do is just eye candy.
Yeah,
it's like they did Coco posters. They did a bunch of things for Deadpool. I worked on a bunch of posters with Deadpool for them, and everything they do is just like, oh my God, it's just such a rich, wonderful looking image for that. So you know, most of the time for that is like, I wish I had the chance to do the retouching work on it. But also, if it's a friend doing it, well, it's kind of hard to get too jealous of a friend, because then what kind of friend are you?
yeah, yeah.
So Dennis, can you comment on, I've seen several posters, and some of them I believe you've even worked on, when they're actually being done internationally. So you've got to deal with a poster for Western tastes. Then you have to deal with a poster that's going to be used in Korea or different parts of Asia, where you're probably dealing with entirely different crews for the marketing of that movie.
No, I actually, for the most part, an awful lot of the international design work is done by the same ad agencies doing the domestic work. So like the Airbender movie I showed, it had Asian writing on it, if I remember correctly. That was an international poster, but it was designed by BLT. And they're here in LA, and they're in the CNN building in downtown LA, or in Hollywood. So an awful lot of that work is done domestically for that. There are some other places doing the design work entirely on, you know, foreign areas, but then they're using completely foreign crews. So I don't get any of that work. Like somebody's not going to call me up from Hong Kong and say, hey, we need you to finish a poster for that, because it'd be a Hong Kong company doing it.
Very cool. I wanted to toss that out because I've had family members that call up and ask me if I've seen different movies that are showing in Japan, and I've never even heard of them here in the US. So I was wondering if any of that had ever come across your desk.
It is common, even with ad campaigns, it is common that you'll have different versions of the images being run in different regions. There was ad campaign I did with a photographer for the rollout of the Boeing 787, the splash image that you guys were using. That was part of that campaign. All the people inside the cockpit or the fuselage of the plane for that. We had different versions of that very image based on the region. So the props people are holding are different props. And one guy's holding a wine glass, but when you're running that in the Middle East, a lot of those places where alcohol is not allowed, like, oh, he's holding drumsticks or something else. And it makes me think I'd much rather sit in front of the guy drinking wine than the guy with the drumsticks, especially for a flight all the way to the Middle East. But, you know, they had to come up with some other set of props, whatever, you know, so that would fit the taste for that market.
So with 30 years of Photoshop, how do you learn what comes up next?
Networking with friends. You know, you have a network of friends, you know, like I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with names like Seth McCullough, Earth Oliver, Lisa Carney, you know, even watching tutorials by like Colin Smith or Jesus Ramirez or, you know, people like that. You're kind of sucking up ideas from all over and trading ideas with friends. So pre-pandemic, we had a informal meetup group here in LA. I called it LA Pixel Pushers. And every 6 or 8 weeks or so, we'd get together. Lisa Carney quite often would host it at her house because she loves to host things like that. And we get together and we just trade stories or hang out and get to know each other. So inevitably there'll be a thing like, oh, let me show you this cool technique I had. Or if you're working in-house next to somebody, you trade tips and ideas and things like that for that. So, you know, that becomes a great way of getting to know what's coming and what's next, and, you know, trying to keep your ear to the ground. And it helps that that you have to have an internal sense of curiosity and love of learning for that. So if I were doing this for 30 years, and I know everything I need to know, I don't want to learn anything more, I'd start dying right away that day, but I would be bored as I can imagine for that. But the idea that like, wow, there's some new cool technique I could try. Like, wow, that's a really cool idea.
Gotta love what those people that are smarter than us actually come up with.
Yeah, and you know, unfortunately, most of them who come up with these ideas are really nice. Like another guy that I love his work is Mark Heaps. He always teaches at Adobe Max or whatever. That guy's one of the most amazing teachers I've seen. And even if it's a program I will never use, I will watch him teach the class just because his ideas about workflow and his approach to things is so inspiring. That'll often give me an idea like, hey, I could apply that to my work in this way.
Hey, Jim, do you want to come on and ask your question, or do you want me to try and read the 2 paragraphs and ask it to the group?
Thanks a lot, Dennis. Actually, really cool presentation. So
thank you
for your time. So yeah, my question is about cost, and you told stories where there's just changes and unexpected changes and more unexpected changes, and you have a way to negotiate for this extra stuff. And I'm just not sure what the temperament is of the studios. Or do they have like a fixed cost in mind, and then it's a hassle trying to get extra pay and you do it for free? Or is that kind of the expected that they're going to be paying extra? I'm just wondering what the business is like.
Well, for the retouching business in general, basically the same kind of rule applies to everything. Specifically for the entertainment agencies, some of the clients have you log your hours. So, you know, like some entertainment agencies will treat you as a W-2 employee, and some will treat you as a 1099 freelancer for that. It doesn't matter to me a whole lot one way or the other. If they treat me as a W-2, they pick up some of the Social Security and they pay me every 2 weeks or whatever their pay cycle is. So that's kind of nice. for that, but it doesn't matter to me one way or the other. But those W-2 people will quite often have a some sort of time tracker thing that you log into and you track your hours. So sometimes it's I start at 10, I finished up at 6, I took a break at whatever. Sometimes it's like just how many hours you worked on a project. So you might break it down to like, you had me work on 4 projects today. I spent an hour and a half on this, 3 hours in that one. You log those hours accordingly. Other clients will call up, and typically the smaller agencies will call up and say, you know, here's what the job is. We have X dollars to do that. Does that work for you? And you might negotiate a little bit. Most of the time, it's like, it's, you know, pretty decent budget. So you do that. I'm like, yeah, fine. When I'm working with photographers or agencies for advertising campaign type stuff, it'll work the same way. You want to make sure you have the business conversation up front. And if you are giving somebody a estimate, you know, this job, retouch these 10 shots is going to cost you X number of dollars. You want to have that agreed to up front. And you want to have a description. Here's what you've described the project as. So here's what you're telling me you want me to do. Here's what the turnaround is. So this is what I'm estimating based on. I'm going to include 2 rounds of revisions for that. I always put in a specification for like 2 rounds of revisions. Sometimes they say, can you give us a 3rd one? Make it 3. Like, okay, fine. I'll give you 3 rounds for that. But the whole purpose for that is to give you a lever to push back with. So like, okay, we're on round 10 of making little tiny changes for that. We agreed to 2. So you realize these other 8 are going to cost you money. It's amazing how that will cut down on a lot of that hassle for you. Because I've had ad agencies actually tell us, okay, we are collecting all the feedback to give you at once so we don't run through these rounds of revisions too quickly. Because ad agencies, they might have 20 people on a project, and you don't want to hear individually from every single one. You want to hear from them all at once, and everybody agree on like, yes, make the face lighter, darken the background. That's what we want. Because inevitably somebody make it lighter. No, I want it more red. No, the background should be green. And you're just going to run around in circles and hate life. So you put in that and you have those conversations up front. When I'm working with the photographer and the photographer's hiring me for the job, I'll tell him, you and I get it to where you think it's ready to show to the client. And then the rounds of revisions kick in when the client gives us feedback. So I will give the photographer that slack. And most of the time, the photographers are really pretty good about it. They don't send me around the bend too many times, you know, trying to noodle every little thing. And you spent 20 hours on a 2-hour job that way.
No, that's actually
the conversation up front.
That's actually a great point that you're bringing up about working with the photographers, because in this day and age, there are so many photographers that will photograph a project and they never even think about working with a retoucher before the project starts. It's probably a lot easier for you to know what style of work a photographer is working with and what they're going to have you working on if you've already done projects with them, and then they have a conversation with you about what the requirement is going to be for their commercial client. So you can then quote them and they can build into their budget how to handle retouching before it even gets to that point.
Right. I had it, you know, like on the jobs we worked together, you know, there was one with the guy with the dogs or whatever like that. A lot of work on the background. You knew to shoot plates of bushes, so we had stuff to fill in. So conversations like that with a photographer up front will be really helpful. There was a photographer I worked with on a project. His client wound up being one of these ones where they're going to try to make a million changes. You know, they originally had a low budget and they wanted fast turnaround. We got that worked out pretty straight. But you know, the client told the photographer one thing, so he comes in to shoot it one way, and then afterwards they're like, "Oh wait, our vision for this is completely different. Now we need you to swap out backgrounds. We need to get rid of this." Like, wait a minute, we could have shot plates when we were there. Now there's nothing to use for this stuff, so now we have to do that. So having the conversation before they shoot it helps a great deal to anticipate what will be needed and give them an idea so they don't, the photographer doesn't underestimate to the client, like, oh yeah, the retouching will be like $5 an image for this. I'm like, what do you mean it's going to be $200 a shot? Now somebody's going to have pain, and nobody's going to like having that conversation with it. So the photographer also has to have an idea of what a reasonable budget is for that. If we work together several times, we all kind of develop that shorthand where, like, okay, there's one photographer I work with, Hunter Freeman. He does amazing product work for that. Hunter and I work together on many different projects. So like now, just say like, okay, this one's gonna be like the last 3 things we've done for that. So we build in the estimate for that, and Hunter knows shoot a blank plate or whatever like that. What I mean is, if he's shooting a product like in a set, he will shoot the set without the product there, and then he'll put the product in it, or put the product and all the props in for that. So now if they say remove that prop, we have a plate that we can just fill in. We have a frame, a capture, where we can just fill in that blank area with, because nothing like trying to make up detail that didn't exist for that. So Hunter already knows to shoot it that way and build it, and we've agreed on the budget and stuff up front for that. So all that stuff gets agreed upon right up front.
Hey,
And
Dale,
now-
I had a quick question. The over the past couple of years, I've been seeing it's mostly through email, of course, and maybe sometimes on the web, but movie posters and campaigns that are animated with cinemagraphs. Like I remember one from House of Cards back when Kevin Spacey was still working. They had there was a movie poster of him sitting on a chair or something. Do you do that kind of stuff, and how does that flow through?
Well, I'm waiting for a client to send me the files to start working on. We're going to be producing 3 cinemagraphs for a pharmaceutical campaign.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to have a background, and they're going to have somebody in the foreground and slight movement for the person in the foreground.
Cool.
For that. So I'm about to start working on that for that. And that was where Jeff Greenberg, who you introduced me to,
Yeah.
hopefully can come in as a backup in case I have any questions about how to pull that off.
No, that's cool.
So in the beginning, I thought there would be a lot of that kind of stuff. And then it turned out to be really pretty rare that I was getting asked to do that.
Mhm.
So I think maybe the movie poster design agencies were, like, oh, that part we're going to do in-house.
Yeah.
Maybe that was how it was being handled. But I always thought, like, oh, that would
It
be.
may have been numbers, maybe it's been, hey, let's spend this extra money to do this animation, and then, or we could just do a regular movie poster. This one costs this much, the regular movie poster is less, and then the return is exactly the same. So just do the regular one, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too is the venues where the stuff's going to be shown.
Yeah.
Remember when digital billboards first came out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, there was a lot of that kind of stuff with digital billboards, or you'd go to the shopping mall and they would have, a big screen displaying something. And then when the digital billboards, people realized, like, you know what, having bright flashing lights that change while people are driving,
Yeah.
not a good idea.
You can't read and get the call to action as you're driving by.
Yeah, exactly. Or the people who live across the street from this, like, it's 2 a.m. I got these bright lights flashing in my window.
Yeah.
So here in LA, at least, all the digital billboards like disappeared overnight.
Really?
And so maybe that affected the amount of call for something like that.
Are they back to just static photos now for the billboards?
The ones I've seen in the billboards, I haven't seen a digital billboard with lights here in LA for quite a while.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
There might be in other cities, but I haven't seen one here in LA for.
I see them in San Francisco mainly on the highways entering San Francisco. You see a couple, but not all over the place. Not like Vegas.
There's a couple here in Corona, and the lawsuits over the billboards right now are expected to run for another 3 years. They've already pulled one of them out.
What are the lawsuits? What's the base of the lawsuits? The light pollution?
Light pollution, number one, and the other lawsuit are the residents that live around the billboards. Because I am a mile from the freeway, it doesn't bother us, but they will light up our living room when they're flashing at night.
Oh,
So
Wow.
it's the same people that choose to move into the airport flight path and then complain about the airplanes.
yeah.
And with that, guys, we're going on about 9 o'clock. If we have a call for any short last questions, we can take them now. Otherwise, I don't want to be apologizing to Dennis's wife for keeping him way too late.
I'll ask one real quick.
Hey, Bobby.
Dennis, hey, it's been a bit. If let's say the movie business ceased to exist, what type of work would you like to do next? I mean, I know you love the movie posters and whatnot, but what else? What other type of work would you like to do?
Well, I think that's where I'm fortunate that I, at least half of my work has been working directly with photographers on ad campaigns and things like that. So, the amount of movie poster work I get changes from year to year. It's picked up in the last couple of years, which I'm really thrilled for. But for a couple of years, like, I only get 1 or 2 projects of those a year. And the other stuff, I'm working on ad campaigns or, pharmaceutical things or lifestyle shots or something like that for that. So I would just continue doing that kind of work. And I love doing a lot of that kind of work. A photographer here in LA, Anthony Nex, who's a great photographer, worked on a lot of product stuff for him the last several months or whatever. It's beautiful product work. And like, I get to work with splashes and flying powder and, cool images like that. So as long as it's a cool image, I love working on it.
Cool.
I think that's a great place to leave the evening.
I tell people I love working on cool images. It could be a really cool shot of a nail, and I would love working on it. And I realize I've said that often enough. Someday I'm going to have to create that cool shot of a nail.
Hey, Dennis, I think if you wanted to add a little bit of fire, Troy might be able to help you out with it.
Oh, with a cool shot of a nail?
With fire and yeah, I got lots of that stuff.
Oh yeah. I remember when I did the stuff for Roger Corman, had to use fire a lot. And so it was back when you had film cameras. I hung up some black Duvetine behind my barbecue and put a bunch of sticks on top of the barbecue and just shot a frame, shot a couple rolls of flames, and then had the photo CD scans done of them so that I could drop them in for whatever. Now nothing will read a photo CD scan, so that's. But yeah, we used to use a lot of flames. That was kind of cool.
Nice. Well, hey, thank you guys. Thank everyone for attending, especially thank you to Dennis for sharing so much information with us. Dennis hangs out with me, Dwayne, Frederick, Joshua. There's a couple of us, David at thisweekinphoto.com. He's got a community over there that it's got some upgrades coming, but just so you know, Dennis hangs out in this community, is a very giving human. He's always volunteering to help people. So I really appreciate that, Dennis, and the kindness that you've shared there. So thank you for taking time to do that with us as well.
Yeah, this Week in Photo community is really good. You got a great tutorial in Capture One there.
I hope it's great. Yeah.
I'm still working my way through it. Still working my way through it, but it's a great resource. And thank you to Frederick for building that.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And I won't share too much, but I know Frederick has got some really great upgrades that he's working on. Some really amazing new stuff is going to be coming.
Can't wait to tell you about it. It's amazing.
Yeah. There's always something. Yeah.
I think it needs a movie.
Yeah, a movie
poster.
There you go. Right.
There you go.
I know a guy.
Ben Johnson, the movie.
With the nail and some fire.
Nailed it.
That's right. All right, everybody. For those of you watching, this will be recorded and eventually I'll get it out on IEPPV's YouTube channel for everybody to review and watch over. And I'll have all of Dennis's links and all that kind of stuff in the description there, so you can chase him down and you can follow him. And I'll put some more information in there about TWIP and what's going on over there as well, so you guys have all the resources that you need. So again, thanks everybody for doing this. We've had a fantastic year, putting all this together. And so keep an eye out for what we might do next year. So
cool.
Everybody be safe,
Thank
be
you very
cool.
much.
Have a good evening. Thanks.
Night, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.